Hello. Oh, okay, we're being recorded. So, good morning. It's very exciting to be talking and meeting today with Julia Ellen Lancaster to discuss her most recent exhibition, Journey to the Centre of the Earth. I'm Georgia Haseldine and I'm the curator of V&A East Storehouse, which is a really exciting new public access store in the east of London, which is opening in 2024. I've come into this role after a few years of working very passionately with clay and thinking about clay in the urban environment and clay in relation to our urban landscapes. I've been working with the artist Theaster Gates, who, as many of you will know, is an amazing ceramicist coming from Chicago, where we've been kind of thinking about the role of clay within the V&A's collection. And it was through one of the projects that I set up as part of this work, which was a brick field in the very industrial heart of Newham, one of London's boroughs, that I first sort of came across Julia and her work. And then we were able to come together again at another later point where we were talking about the kind of the role of early porcelain manufacture within London. So that's a bit of an introduction from me, but without further ado, I think we should hear a bit from you, Julia, and maybe you can introduce yourself and your practice.
Thanks, Georgia. So my name is Julia Ellen Lancaster. I am an artist essentially working with clay and have been for some years now. Although my journey to clay has probably been a slightly different one, I suppose. I didn't train with or undertake any kind of formal training with clay and ceramics. I actually started working with clay slightly later in my life, and so much of it has been self-taught, although I've definitely benefited from lots of very generous people and peers who have helped me along the way. I work in a way that uses to some extent materials that I excavate from the ground myself, so clay and minerals and rocks from various sites across the UK. I was up until fairly recently based in East London, but at the moment I am now based in Kent. And the show that I'm currently exhibiting, Journey to the Centre of the Earth, at M2 Gallery in Peckham, is one that came about with the curator there, Penny Skerrett, who has been extremely generous in having faith in me as an artist, in the work that I was going to produce for the space there. So yeah, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. So maybe that's a little about me.
Yeah, and I think it would be great to just dive a bit more into what you've been doing in Peckham with M2 Gallery, and maybe you could just paint for us a bit of a picture of, you step off the overground at Queen's Road, Peckham, and just round the corner, you're suddenly going to be faced with some of your amazing sculptures. It would be just great if you could just paint us a little picture of what you see. What pieces are you looking at? What's the experience like?
Yeah, it's really interesting for me, and one of the reasons why I was so keen to exhibit there is actually because of the space itself, and the story behind the M2 Gallery, which is very much as a space that was set up by an architect who wanted to in some way give back to the community, and there's a lot to be said about that, but probably isn't the time. So really but for me, it held a lot of synergy with my own values of how I work. So the space itself was, was fairly significant. It does sit at the end of a residential street. It's very visible from the street. The exhibition spaces, which comprises of a window gallery and a small pavilion, does mean that hundreds of people are walking past it every day, seeing the work, and it has become very much a part of the locality and the community. And again, that is something that I was really drawn to. And my work sits in these window spaces, and the dimensions of the space are such that kind of, to some extent, dictated obviously the work that I was going to make for the space. And the idea that you can see it 24 hours, 7 days a week, which means it's viewable at night time when it's lit, and it produces quite a kind of dramatic setting in a way. And the sculptures, which have been described by various people as quite kind of futuristic, but also very grounded in the materials that I'm using, and very organic in a sense, sitting on the high street on this kind of concrete concrete road. It's not really a high street, but which really draws the viewer into looking at the space, and also the gallery as a community space itself. There are lots of things that other projects that happen at the community space, as well as it providing living accommodation for artists, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what I sort of felt when I kind of came to come and view the exhibition and look around it with you a few weeks ago, was that, yeah, you kind of, this unexpected piece of geological time has just kind of fallen onto a Peckham residential street, and you're looking at these delicate kind of almost eerie sculptures that feel like they're doing something. They're as busy as me, there's something happening with them. They've got their own, they've got their roots going off to places you can't quite see around the pavilion, and the glazes and finishes of them make them seem timeless and ancient, whereas as you say, also like something maybe out of science fiction. And I think that, yeah, maybe we could kind of start perhaps with the Revolver 1 and Revolver 2, which were two sculptures you placed in the pavilion, one of the pavilion spaces outside, because these ones, I believe, are, they're the way you're really directly speaking to this kind of the history of the kind of mycelium network, and like what mycelium networks mean. And I think that this is such such an exciting area for us at the moment, because it's, as you say, not only is this an area for sort of scientific investigation as we kind of greater understand our world, but also there's some fantastic work and thought going on at the moment about how mycelium networks can demonstrate these levels of communality and community that perhaps a space like M2 is trying to kind of create as well. And I guess here I'm definitely thinking about Anna Singh and her work and research. And I was reading recently about her project at Aarhus University, where she's studying this old clay extraction mine in Denmark, where there's a new there's some trees are starting to kind of self-seed themselves within this space. And she found this one fragile birch tree that shouldn't be growing there at all. And the only way it's growing there is because of a particular type of oh, sorry, there's an alarm on my computer. Sorry about that, but there's a particular type of fungus that is growing in this kind of clay extraction waste that is enabling a birch tree to grow. And it's nothing to do with the soil or anything else that's around in the ground. It's due to this particular fungus. And I think that for me, that level of coordination, as she calls it, between species is deeply inspiring. And I just love to hear a bit more about why this has become something you're wanting to engage with. Why have you wanted to put this onto a street in Peckham?
That's so interesting about Anatin and the work. I mean, and really, it's probably helpful for me to just talk a little bit about the background behind my thinking process for this work. And actually, I was spending a lot of time at a museum in Kent called the Powell Cotton Museum, where there is a vast collection of over 20,000 world culture objects, mostly originating from African and Asian continents, that were collected by Percy Powell Cotton and his two daughters, at the who lived where the museum is now, and looking and thinking about the unrecorded people in the making of the collection and the wider stories. And that's something that I'm particularly interested in when engaging with museums and with collections. But I was actually really drawn to the grounds and the gardens. There is this very, very beautiful walled garden with Victorian Victorian glass houses, and in the grounds of the garden there is one tree in particular which is a Japanese pagoda tree, which is believed to have been planted around 1889, I think it is. And this particular tree, which just looks amazing, I mean, it's difficult to describe a Japanese pagoda tree, but if you're familiar with them, you'll know that they can grow for over long periods of time, and they are very kind of twisted and knotty. And this particular tree has completely engulfed the metal structure which was originally built to support it. So now it's almost as if the tree supports this structure. You couldn't remove it without destroying the structure, or vice versa, which is kind of interesting because for me somehow it symbolized a kind of shifting balance of power. And there was this idea that these trees and these structures over the years, because there's a number of these structures in the garden, had sort of acted as shelters and almost like listening chambers to the many people that have lived there, and particularly the workers of the estate. And in fact, I was told by one of the team that these shelter places still acted as meeting points for staff at the museum and the staff at the grounds. And I started to think about the history of these trees and the immense strength that they possessed. And I was also reading a fascinating book, which I think you know, Georgia, called Entangled Life by Merlin Sheldrake. which really looks much closer at the mycelium networks that exist beneath the ground, some of which, we know have continued to grow over hundreds of years and connect all these trees, and how they communicate with each other, and the network, and this kind of network being its own self-supporting system. So there is this idea that we're not so different as humans to the hyphae and fungi that exists in this network, but this network, which is referred to as the wood wide web, that this network has got it right, that it's found a way to thrive and work together in a way that perhaps humans haven't. And so in the same way, I'm kind of using clay and minerals dug from the ground, which essentially themselves represent millions of years of change, investigating the relationships between the landscape and the human body, essentially, which I see as kind of connected and interchangeable. And Journey to the Centre of the Earth, which, incidentally takes its title from Jules Verne's fictional account of the Journey to the Centre of the Earth, which was written way back in 1864. My work kind of considers, or attempts to, in some way, consider the importance of the mycelium network, and it's a continuation of my exploration, or kind of exploring geopolitical, environmental, social themes to make change, to sort of make sense of that changing world. And so although I quite often think my work is quite intuitive, I'm just from that, those references that I've just kind of outlined, it takes me quite a long time to go through a process that will just kind of continue changing and working through, to make work that somehow is connected to that. I'm still, learning an awful lot about the mycelium network, and I think it's something that we're only just beginning to understand its importance and its value. So I've probably kind of gone off at a bit of a tangent there, but
no, I think that's some really interesting different areas for us to kind of to walk down, I think, from there, because I guess there's a few different things I'd like us to talk about, I guess, around things around time and around change. But perhaps first, maybe just to think a little bit more about the sort of beautiful way you're evoking what it means to work with clay and with earth minerals, and how this connects you to these millions of years of change and geological process that created them in the first place. I was reading the other day that every year humans now, in our kind of Anthropocene age, we move more soil and clay and earth than any other natural erosion force, which really just blew my mind, because I was like, you think of these amazing rivers and the general kind of collapse of and change that is always happening around material, but then to think that actually, we as humans, we're moving all of this stuff. So I guess I'd like to hear a bit more about what that process of extraction and kind of means for you, and also maybe just talk me through about what you do. Like, how do you go and get your wild clay? Like, what do you do with it when you've got it? I think that would be really interesting to hear.
It is a kind of an interesting area. I mean, when I dig clay or rocks from the ground, I'm thinking very much about what I'm removing, what I'm disturbing, in a sense. and literally, you know, I am going out with my trowel, and you'll kind of, you know, you'll often see me sort of, well, particularly at the moment where I am in Kent, walking along the coast line, with a trowel and a bag, because I'm always kind of, in a sense, you know, foraging and looking very closely at the cliffs and the backshore areas along the coast, and I'm looking for clay, and people often ask me, you know, well, how do you know when you where clay is or where to find it? And you know, there is a kind of I suppose, in to some extent, it's through experience. You kind of, you can spot clay just from the way that it looks in it, and very importantly, the way it feels. And I'm then, you know, digging only small amounts of clay, and putting it through a process which involves kind of drying and washing, and reconstituting it into a form that I can actually make something with. But I know there are, you know, there of course are bigger questions to be asked as to whether kind of extraction of natural resources, in effect, has an effect on things like poverty and inequality, and I'm very conscious of that when I'm sort of thinking about, and when I am digging clay or minerals from the ground, and I don't necessarily know what exactly it is always until perhaps I get it back to the studio and I'm doing a little bit of, you know, research on it to try and kind of ascertain what it is. Actually, it springs to mind a Richard Batterman, who is a studio potter, said, I read something that he said very recently, which was something along the lines of feeling it necessary to use skills and materials with humility and respect. I think it was something like that. And I'm very conscious of this in the choices that I make. And I don't throw anything away in the studio. So of all the, you know, the materials that I collect, I don't actually throw anything away. I'm constantly reusing materials. I might kind of almost consider myself similar to that of a bricoleur, you know, that notion of kind of taking fragments of what is to hand and reassembling them and turning them into something else. But for this piece of work, go on, sorry.
No. I was just thinking that when we were looking at the sculptures you made for M2 Gallery, I spotted something that looked like a kind of the curve of a plate rim or something like that, and asked you, oh, what's that from? Like, you know, where did you find that? And I thought that was a really, I mean, tell us more. Why was there a little fragment of black plate that could be kind of seen inside a sculpture? Because I think it speaks to your bricoleur quality.
For sure, definitely, yes. And there's a lot of that when you look quite closely at the work, but you wouldn't necessarily, you know, recognize what it is straight away. But I think you did with your you know, your keen eye and your experience, Georgia. You kind of recognized what really was just a very kind of vague sense of a rim of a plate, which actually came from some plates that I'd made during a residency I did last year as part of the Leach 100 centenary celebrations. and I was making plates, which I don't normally make. You know, I'm not a kind of functional potter in that sense. But I was making these plates purely as a canvas to try out some glazes that I was making from rocks I was gathering there. And long story short, the plates, when they were fired, there was 30 of these plates, and every one of them was cracked, and except one, and quite badly kind of, you know, cracked. But you know, me being me, the way that I work, it was like, okay, well, that's fine, they'll just be used in something else that I make. So they became part of my, almost my tool set, my kind of sometimes I refer to it as my rubble collection, which is just a big bucket of pieces that I will sometimes have come from work that I have made previously or rejected, or they'll literally be pieces that I have picked up and found, you know, found materials, and rework those into a piece. So,
and I think,
yes.
yeah, no, that's yeah, I love this use of the kind of, yeah, the bricoleur idea of, and also how important reuse is to your work. And I think, I guess it would be interesting now just to kind of, something that we sort of touched on a little bit earlier that I'd love us to dwell a bit more on, was around also the kind of idea of like change and time within your work as well, because I think there's some significant amount of process go into works, that and this idea of duration, but also of chance, like what happens when things are fired. And I'm sure any geeky ceramicists who've seen your work down at M2 Gallery have spent a lot of time poring over, how on earth have you got that particular glaze? How is this so unctuous? How is this showing such a, you know, kind of amazing range of colours? And there's obviously that sort of technical delight, but also the sort of the chance in what happens when these materials vitrify. And yeah, I'd love to just hear a bit more about how that process has worked in relation to this particular project as well, like how you've created these amazing forms and surfaces.
Yes, and I think you're absolutely right. You know, there is, I think, when you work with clay, there is always that element of chance, that element of risk, almost like risk taking, and that is and has always been a big part of my work, where you can't control everything. You almost have to hand over a sense of your own power. And again, I think there's some interesting, you know, things around that kind of notion of us letting go and us kind of sharing a kind of power. But with clay, you know, because clay will always push back a little bit, you can't always, you can't absolutely control clay. And once you've put it in the kiln and you fire it to, you know, very high temperatures, then the reaction that is going to take place with the minerals or the clays and the glazes that you are using is not always predictable. I'm sure, you know, there are some people out there that work with clay and ceramics who are very, very good and very skilled at kind of being able to replicate something that they really want to do again. You know, they really want the same glaze, and they will spend a very long time obviously making sure they understand how they've achieved that glaze and the components they've used. But for me, that's not really what I'm trying to do. You know, I'm not really trying to ever kind of replicate the same thing again. I never make the same thing again.
Mm.
I'm always and continually trying to change the boundaries, push what I'm doing to a different level, and really having to kind of let go, you know, and that's something that I think we find quite hard as humans to sort of let go and devolve that kind of sense of control sometimes. But it can be really valuable, you know, exercise or way of producing work. It can be really kind of you can learn an awful lot from that. So yeah, it's something that I, you know, it's a sort of love-hate relationship that I have with clay and ceramics, because, you know, inevitably sometimes things can go quite horribly wrong. And you end up with kind of, you know, thankfully not very often, but a terrible kind of mess in the kiln, which is not really, can be quite kind of destructive.
Yeah. No, I had a kind of a massive meltdown recently that was very horrible to watch. Where you were like, oh no, all these lovely things, they've all just adhered together, and everything's fallen off and crawled, and it made me upset. But actually, one of the little things that I made that came out of that experience is I've now grown to love, and it sits on my windowsill, and I look at it every day and go, oh, you made it through, even if there was nothing about this that was expected, but you've created something out of it. And I sort of, I feel like this idea of things not being quite finished, but also about things being taken and created, you know, sort of like from all different parts of your practice, so that even though, you know, people might come and see what's your work at M2 Gallery, they might be seeing something that's a fragment of a project that began in Cornwall, you know, like a few years ago. I love this, and I think that in some ways that also creates and mimics the kind of mycelium network ideas, isn't it? Is this idea that you can't just, as an artist, you can't just work on one set of things and then not have this kind of, it's not even a ripple effect, is it? It's just like a communication across a network of all the other stuff you're working on, and it lights up other parts of your practice that you've worked on previously that then feel like they make more sense because you've engaged with this other part in a different way. And yeah, I just think, I mean, I think that's one of the things that's really powerful about your work. I guess,
no, I was just gonna say, Georgia, I mean, I think it's interesting that you say that, because I every now and then I kind of, you know, when you have a moment where you're kind of wondering where you're going with a piece of work or something, and you know, then I'll quite often spend some time kind of looking back through references, or you know, it might be visual references, or pieces that are kind of sitting on my shelves in the studio, and you know, I'll be reminded very quickly that there is this kind of there's this thread that runs through that may not be very obvious, you know, to other people or to the viewer, but there is you know, I'm constantly reminded, oh yeah, actually that's why I'm doing this now, because you know, that thing that I was looking at 2 years ago is still in my head, and that's kind of, you know, fed into the thing that I was doing last year, and that's fed into, you know, the thing that I'm doing today. And I mean, I really, really value that, and I love that. But it also makes me think kind of about projecting into the future, because there is this sort of natural thread of thinking. And you know, there's so many things kind of going on in the world, aren't there? That there's so much. We live in such a kind of polarized world. and some of those things that, you know, happen in the world, and that when you're thinking about the future, can make you very kind of defensive and almost angry. But for me, I think through the process of making and kind of craft in some ways, but, you know, essentially for me, making, I can kind of channel some of that confusion and that sadness about injustice to come out the other side and kind of keep making and keep thinking that I can have an impact, and that making and creative thinking can have an impact on changing things for the better in the world. I mean, that sounds very grand, and I wouldn't assume that that's what
No.
But it's just that thread, you know.
Yeah, and I think this is a really important part of your work, and also it's, you know, it's also how we've met, is through this belief that clay is a powerful tool to bring people together. That as a media, it can kind of it can meet people on whatever level they are, and it can be very expressive of our wider culture, you know. So the work that I've been doing with Rosanna Martin and Brickfield has all been about, you know, how can we think about the clay beneath our feet and then understand the cities that we are building and what futures there are for those. And I think that for me, the experience of working with individuals from all sorts of different communities and backgrounds and levels of skill shows that clay is almost like a gateway into being able to express yourself and being able to truly to kind of be able to communicate and shape the world around you. And I think that is something about the way clay manipulates as well, isn't it? It's like it can take so much, and it doesn't take a lot of effort to shape it, but we can imprint it in all these different ways. And I know that this is an important part of your work as well, as this kind of democratizing effect of culture through clay. It'd be lovely to hear a bit more about that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something that you just have to come to a sort of personal choice, don't you, about how you work and what you're doing. And I couldn't, just the sort of actual haptic qualities of working with clay is something that I'm very kind of, you know, obsessed with, and I can't stop. You know, it is a sort of obsession, but it's the choices that you make along the way of how you can use that to engage with other people, and and perhaps kind of and that can, you know, that can be anything from very pragmatic things, whereby perhaps, you know, you get an opportunity to in a project or something, and you can find ways of bringing along other people to that project, and enabling other people to benefit from that opportunity. Sometimes as artists we can be quite kind of you know, singular, and sometimes you have to be, but you know, if there are, I'm always kind of really interested in the idea of how we can share, and I often refer to this term of kind of privilege sharing, and how we all have a responsibility to share that kind of learning, those skills, those opportunities. We all have that responsibility, and so I'm forever kind of, you know, looking for that as well in my work. It's you know, almost inevitably you don't always feel like you kind of achieve very satisfactorily that, but some, you know, sometimes it works, but and sometimes, you know, I do have to work in a very kind of solitary way, because quite a lot, sometimes it's just the kind of the hard labor of working with clay and the processing of clay, but yeah, I don't know if that really answers your question, but there are lots of, interesting.
I think it does beautifully, Julia, because I think it's exactly, yeah, it's like, yeah, the individual pleasures of it, but then also how do we involve and how do we collaborate and how do we coordinate and how do we, a bit like the mycelium networks that you're sort of examining, how can, like, you know, how can you just kind of affect in, you know, in whatever way we can, the learning and sharing with others, because it just makes us a bit more like that Japanese pagoda tree that you were talking about, isn't it? That we can all kind of, you know, you can then take, some people can take the weight of more of others, and you can kind of, you know, those initial structures can kind of dissipate after a while, can't
they? Absolutely. And that's one of the things I really love about the opportunities that museums provide. You know, I mean, when I was a kid, I used to hate going to museums with, you know, my mum used to drag me along to museums, and they just didn't speak to me at all. And of course now my feeling has completely changed, where and I know you know, lots of museums are working really hard to kind of re-engage with their communities and rethink the narratives and address some of those kind of you know, stilted narratives. But one thing I really, you know, like about working with museums is that opportunity, that ability to completely kind of change what you're looking at and reinterpret it for a different kind of engagement, and you know, they just provide so much source of inspiration just from the fact that they carry, you know, all of these objects or artifacts that you know, sometimes been handmade, obviously depending on the museum, but a lot of kind of museums who have these kind of handmade collections, and you therefore, it gives you the opportunity to think about their history, which then in turn helps you or makes you want to think about the future of our kind of living history and what we're leaving behind for future generations. And this idea of the future museum, which is something that's recurring a lot in my work. But I remember you telling me, Georgia, about the fragment of Robin Hood Gardens at that will be at V&A East, and that was something that I was really, really fascinated by, because obviously remembering kind of the history behind Robin Hood Gardens and the lengthy kind of process that went through of trying to be saved and then eventually kind of, you know, being knocked down. But it's I mean, you were telling me a little bit about how that fragment, albeit just a fragment, is a kind of opportunity to raise some of those stories from that community and to think about how housing is approached and thought about in the borough, and how can it help those conversations going forward? Was that am I right in thinking that's what it was about?
Totally, and I think it's I think it raises such complex questions that I think you're already sort of alluding to around, what happens when something gets put into a museum? What is a museum object, and how does it is it sort of dead once it goes into one of these spaces, or are there ways that we can kind of understand it more? And it's one of the things that I know that we've talked about in the past, is like also the sort of pleasures of looking at an object as a maker and as a as an art practitioner, where if you can pick something up and look at it, you can start to understand all the people and all the processes that have gone into its creation, whether that's from the extraction of the original material through all the different ways that it has been made, and then also then how it's been used, and then it kind of lands into one of these places, a museum, and then it's kind of like, what do you do with it next? And I think that's my big question for the Robin Hood Gardens fragment, is that it's amazing. We're going to have these two maisonette flats, and it's the sort of the concrete facade that has been built into the architecture at V&A East Storehouse, and it's sort of it's like we've got this thing, and it's got to decide what's going to happen with it next, and how do we make sure that it's, rather than turning it into a historic object that talks about past dreams and struggles and lives, how do we work with our local communities to mean that we can acknowledge and think about those histories, but also how, the next step of that, how do we instead think about what else we need? We know that that in London at the moment there is a huge housing crisis. The housing crisis because there's not nearly enough affordable housing for people. There's lots of unaffordable housing that is sitting empty. What do we do? What do we do about that? But also, what do we do about design? Robin Hood Gardens was a whole poured concrete building and structure. Could we ever think that was now a good thing to do, when we know that concrete is the most polluting thing that we as humans are doing on this planet? So I think that there's some very complicated kind of issues it's raising around like, what should we be doing to build and address for our kind of housing futures? And that's the sort of, I think that for me is why we need to be working with practitioners, with communities, to understand our past, but then also to really look at our future and think what we can dream up together, because we're not doing it right at the moment. And more large concrete buildings like Robin Hood Gardens aren't going to work, because it's going to cause, it's going to exacerbate the already, dire climate emergency. Which is a bit of a horrible note to kind of start closing things on. But I think, I guess, thinking in that kind of future forward-looking way. I know that we've said that very few of your works are ever finished, and that they're often, these assemblages that kind of keep accreting and changing and kind of gaining new life and new form through these different kind of connected projects. But I wondered if you wanted to say a few words about what's next for you, like what's going to be happening, what's on the horizon, what are you intrigued by? Because I think that exhibition making is a form of learning and a form of practice, and sometimes we don't necessarily give ourselves time to reflect on what actually that means to have put those things together in that way, and then to think of that as part of that creative process, and kind of learning as well.
No, you're right. And interestingly, the work that is at M2 is such, some of that work I'm already kind of thinking about kind of almost reconfiguring some of the pieces, or that some of the pieces will for sure end up being in new work that I'll make. So which is a funny kind of one, because it's it means that potentially those works as they are won't necessarily ever be seen again in a, you know, in that kind of, or any setting, which might seem slightly strange to some people, but for me it is just part of that kind of, you know, ongoing process, and it doesn't worry me that necessarily you know, that those works as they are won't then kind of necessarily, you know, go and be shown in another setting or another space. Yeah, I mean, it's true, I don't really ever feel that I really finish work or maybe resolve work, you know, as soon as I've kind of made something. There is a point where I sort of have to take a step back and let it go for a little while and let it sit, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's resolved or finished. I think that's maybe something I'm sure that perhaps a lot of artists feel, but it's something about it is about how I feel about those works, you know. Do they and feeling is something that's very important to me. You know, I want to be making work that I feel something about, literally, that it kind of sparks an emotion. I often think about the way that a piece of music can be very emotive and can, you know, some kind of classic epic, quite often film music can evoke emotions in people, very kind of strong emotions, and I think I'm often trying to kind of capture that in my work, which I think is incredibly difficult, but it is about it is the difference between kind of seeing, looking, and feeling, you know, and the feelings that you experience from a piece of work or a series of works, and maybe that is why I never really feel that I kind of have a sort of completely resolved or finished piece of work, because you know, I'm always kind of continually searching for that. Yeah, it's a funny one, but it's something that I'm kind of I've slightly more come to terms with, I think, is that I don't necessarily want to feel I've got to make a kind of, you know, finished piece of work, and actually I have already changed one of the pieces of work at the gallery, and so there's another kind of interesting dimension there, in that some people who have been to see the work in the early weeks, and those people that have seen it in later weeks, have actually seen different work, which I quite like that idea, and of course they won't necessarily realise that's happens and that's the case, but that raises some kind of interesting ideas again around kind of, you know, how we view work, how we can shift somebody's thinking.
And I think and I guess just to kind of to sort of add to that as well, is, you know, I think that your work, I definitely felt there was a real sort of visceral feeling about the works that you'd created, and I could feel in myself this kind of, you walk a really tightrope walk, I think, in many of those pieces, where you're kind of at one hand there's this kind of this like tempered beauty, where it's almost like you're trying to control it to stop it becoming too gorgeous, too luscious, and then other moments where then there's this kind of almost feeling of like the grotesque, like you're seeing inside, you know, a sort of something that you shouldn't be able to see inside of, you know. And then I think that it feels like between those, you're, despite the kind of the breadth and depth of your kind of intellectual backbone, I think, that is kind of creating this work. You know, these complex ideas, these new parts of science that are really experimental, and all of us are struggling to get our heads around, let alone like the top scientists in the world who are investigating them. You've got all of that threading through it, but then on top of that, it's like you're not allowing us just to have an intellectual relationship with these pieces. They've got to have an emotional resonance, which is so exciting. And I think maybe we should just pull things to the close now with just asking you, Julia, just to tell us how long can people see this for, and a little bit of that.
Because I could, we could talk about some of those things for endlessly, Georgia, and I'm looking forward to an opportunity that we will. But
likewise.
But Journey to the Centre of the Earth is on until the 20th of November, so a couple of more weeks. And then I'm doing some work that will be another exhibition actually early next year, but that's kind of in the early stages. But M2 Gallery, is there, and as I say, you can go any time of the day, because it's quite I do recommend that people go at dusk or after dark if they can be bothered, because it's a slightly different experience, but you can view the work 24/7. So
I had a friend go, and I recommended to a friend that they call in on the way back from a dance night that they'd been to. So they came back at 4 a.m. They cycled past it and said it looked absolutely splendid. So I think I've definitely got rave reviews for the late night viewing of this exhibition.
Well, thank you so much, Georgia. It's been really
brilliant,
interesting to talk to you, and you've kind of really sort of picked up on so many of the thinking around my work, so thank you.
Well, thank you, Julie.